Welcome everyone, welcome and good morning. And a couple of things are going to kind of roll together here today that just kind of floated by in passing last week, but during this week they kind of brought themselves into a little bit more clarity and into this theme of touching omnipotence, touching omnipotence. I mentioned last week in the closing treatment that Dr. Frederick Bailes, the quote was from Frederick Bailes, and he's one of my favorite teachers. In fact, I mentioned to you that I have one of his books that I always keep by my side, and I forgot to mention when I picked it up this week to look at it that it is an autographed. I don't know if you can see it on the YouTube. It is an autographed copy of the book. It was given to me by a gentleman named Sam Ronnie, who is a practitioner at the Atlanta church in Atlanta, Georgia. And he gave it to me many years ago when I was studying to be a practitioner. And Frederick Bailes signed the flyleaf on this book on October the 1st, 1941. He inscribed it to someone, I guess the person who purchased it or who was gifted the book. Somehow it wound up in Sam's possession, and now it's in mine. So Dr. Bailes has a chapter in this book, Your Mind Can Heal You, called The Powerhouse Within. The Powerhouse Within. And to simplify that, I just call that omnipotence. Omnipotence. And the other thing that that kind of came by in passing, I was struggling last week trying to remember the name of the Shaker hymn, and the name of the Shaker hymn I was talking about was Simple Gifts. Simple Gifts. 'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free. Simple gifts. And then Aaron Copland took that melody and turned it into a composition, and it became a ballet, and it was scored for a 13-piece orchestra, and it had several movements, and it had dancers, and it had all those things. And if you just go on to the internet and look for either Simple Gifts or Appalachian Spring is the name of Copland's work, it'll come right up, and I'm sure it will be familiar to you. And the irony that struck me when it came up last week is that here the Shakers were trying to make everything as simple as possible. Simple as possible. What was the most important thing in their lives? And the most important things in their lives was to serve God as they understood that. And that's why everything they made was made so well. You know, what they felt that what they were doing was they were expressing God in their work, and God did make no junk. You know, so everything they did was well made. They were able to weave a waterproof garment in the 1800s, and they came up with a cloth that needed no ironing. So I guess they had the first permanent press long before people in New York thought that they had invented it. So I started to think about, you know, the Shakers. I remembered that Ken Burns had made a documentary on the Shakers. I saw it some years ago. It was actually a second documentary that he made. The first one was the Brooklyn Bridge, and then the second one was about the Shakers. So I was able to get a copy through the library and watched it again, and I was just kind of enamored at the simple faith of this group of people. And if I were to boil down or try to boil down the message that I got from watching this show, from listening to the few surviving Quakers, they're a celibate group, so the only way that they could keep their numbers up was to keep recruiting. And of course, to recruit people from the post-Civil War world, when we entered started to enter the Industrial Revolution and move things into mills and things like that, their numbers started to dwindle. You know, it was for people to give that up and move into a celibate life in a utopian community. Folks were no longer interested in that. So their numbers are dying off. I think now they're down to two. There's two Shakers left in the United States, and all the rest have died out. But there was a quote in the show, and I was able to go back and find it in a book on Google, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it because I don't remember it exactly. But it said, "Are you really free? the paragraph started a question, are you really free? Really? And we all want to be free, I was chatting with someone who's a small business consultant. She works with people who want to go into business for themselves, and a lot of people want to go in business for themselves because they think it's freedom, but then they find out that they get into business for themselves, and it's less freedom than going to work for somebody for 40 hours a week. Freedom. Everybody craves freedom. We all want freedom. We all think we're free. We sing about freedom. But the question that the Quaker, not the Quaker, I'm sorry, the Shaker eldress, they called her, asked was, are you really free? Or are you still bound by any desires or appetites or opinions of the world? Do you lead your life based on what your neighbors or your society expects of you, even if it's an absurd expectation? Even if it doesn't make any sense at all? Are we doing kind of absurd things? And she went on to say that those things don't present a problem for a true shaker, because the true shaker, through will of desire to make their contact with the divine, right? Then the activity of the divine flow through them kind of takes those desires away, kind of frees them from the opinion of society, from the norms of culture, from our I don't know, greed is exactly the right word for it, but it comes along that line. Our desire to possess things, and our desire to be in control of things, and our ego desire for status, and to be remembered. And as I mentioned to you, even in the cemeteries, some tombstones are higher than other. People want to be remembered. They want to leave something behind, and all of that is unimportant in the greater scheme of things. Not that work itself was unimportant, but working for those purposes was unimportant. So what I got out of that when I was listening to that was touching omnipotence. Touching omnipotence. If we spend time examining the written works, like Bailes' work, Your Mind Can Heal You, Jeffrey's work, Principles of Healing, if we spend Emma Curtis Hopkins in her works, as we spend time reading these different works, right, the same message kind of comes through. Even in our Wednesday night group, we have studied many different authors. We've listened to different lectures on tape and on YouTube, and the message keeps coming through over and over and over again. It's already here. It's already now. God is. God is perfect. God is whole. God is complete. Our only task, if we choose to call it a task, our only task then is to touch that. Is to consciously recognize, consciously realize, consciously experience its presence. When we first start to experience, we might think it's around us, or near us. Then we kind of move to think, well, no, but it's in us. You see, it's in us. It's everywhere. It's in us. And eventually, we come to the recognition that it is as us, as us. In other words, there is no, I realize this is grammatically not correct, there is no us apart from God. There's only God. There's only one. There's only one presence. There's only one life. There's only one love. At that point, when we start to come to that point, this is what I was talking last week, we start with the desire to have no desires, but that in itself is a desire, and it seems like an oxymoron. To desire to have no desires is a desire, so therefore is that desire wrong? It's kind of a catch-22. And the answer is no, you have to start where you are. You have to start somewhere. So we start by recognizing the end state, and the end state is a state in which we simply are. God simply is. And we move through the things that we ought to do along the way to get to the point where finally we surrender and we say, I'm fulfilled. There are no desires. There are no desires. There's just God. There's just the presence of God. So the dissolution then of the ego and the intellect that we read about and talk about, particularly in Eastern religions. In Christianity, you'll find somewhat the same idea, which is to surrender to God, to selfless service, to surrender to God, to have no desires other than what God desires. All are saying the same thing in one way or another. Right? Some sing it, some, like the Shakers, they're moved by it. They dance. They have to dance to express it. They express it in their work. But we're all getting to this, to the same simple idea, the same simple points. Right? We don't have to make it so hard. We don't have to make things more complicated than they ought to be. Life is simple. Truth is simple. Love is simple. Dr. Bailes, in his book, he kind of gives us the example of a baby, the process as the body of the baby is formed in the mother's womb, so perfectly and yet so simply. Everything is worked out, everything is laid out in perfect order, everything happens at the appropriate time. So simply. And when the baby is born, it already knows how to suckle. It already knows that. All the mother has to do is to place the child to her breast. And there's an intelligence, an omniscience within that little body that knows exactly what to do. And there's an intelligence within the mother's body that knows exactly what to do. And it's simple. It's so simple, It's not like you have to go to school for years to learn how to do it. It's not like the child has to grow up and has to be taught like it has to be taught mathematics. It knows exactly what to do, and it's very, very simple. It's very, very simple. So these two different approaches of the Shakers and Dr. Bailes kind of were interweaving their way through my consciousness this week as I watched the video, as I read a little bit more about the Shakers, and as I read through Dr. Bailes. And we just want to briefly share some of these ideas this morning, some of these ideas. But we start, like Covey says, in his 7 Habits, you start with the end in mind. And the end in mind is touching omnipotence. Now, just one last point on that before we move along is, and we've said this many times on Sundays and in classes and things like that. Religion is when we believe in someone else's experience of the presence of God. And spirituality is when we believe in our own. Spirituality is when we believe in our own. And the examples I gave, were the Christianity about Jesus started what Paul had his experience and was knocked off the horse. We might consider that Judaism got its start when Moses experienced the burning bush, which Rocco Errico says is a metaphor for a deep meditation. Right? The fire that burns but does not consume, the fire within us, the fire that raised, it was Elijah into heaven in a chariot of fire. Right? The consciousness was uplifted by this touching the omnipotence. Mohammed had an experience. Joseph Smith had an experience. And the lady who founded the Shaker movement, Ann Lee, had a mystical experience. So religions tend to start when someone has an experience of the presence of the divine. They touch the omnipotence. And then they go and they tell others about it. And other people believe in their experience. Now, for someone who does not believe in any particular doctrine, they would look at that and say, well, you know, that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know whether that experience was a real experience or a made-up experience. You know, I don't believe that. But for the people who do believe, it becomes their religion. It becomes their religion. But we have to ask ourselves, is the end that we have in mind, the desire that we have in mind for our spiritual growth, is it to believe in someone else's experience, or is it to have our own? To have our own experience? Do we wish to listen and read and travel across the world to go to retreats, to listen to others talk about their experience? Or do we wish to have our own experience? Do we wish to have our own experience? And what I'm suggesting is touching omnipotence, the experience, the conscious awareness of the experience of the presence of God, touching omnipotence. That is what it's about for all of us. That is what it's about for all of us. All of our readings, and I'm not saying we shouldn't read or we shouldn't study or we shouldn't go on retreats. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do any of those things. We should do everything that helps us to grow spiritually. But growing spiritually is growing into a deeper conscious awareness of that experience of the presence of God. And we should realize while we are doing all of those other things that they are for that purpose. They are for the purpose of facilitating, of helping us to have our own experience. Essentially our own religion, if you want to call it that. So Ann Lee, who founded the Shaker movement, she had this experience. And she came from England to the United States, and it was just around the time of the Revolution. She came here, and she painted this picture for people, this picture that was very attractive. And what they were going to do is they were going to come together in spiritual community. They were going to stop living in what the world had come to see as the normal, what the world had accepted as normal. And they were going to do something different. And in her mind and in her followers' minds, what they were doing was they were living life as simply as possible. And in so doing, they were living life the way that they thought that Jesus had lived. And one of the ladies in the show that they interviewed, she said, you know, we're not against people getting married and having children. If that's your calling in life, if that's your path in life, then that's what you follow. She said, but I feel that we were called to live this way to show people the value of simple living, of living simply for the purpose of loving God. Now this spilled over into their work, into everything that the Shakers did. So what happened is the furniture that they made, the businesses that they ran, and they ran many successful businesses in order to generate money to keep the communities going. Everything they did they did to the best of their ability, to the best. You know, not just okay, not just, yeah, that ought to do it, you know, but to the best of their ability. And I want you to think about that. Just think about how our economy runs and how our society runs, you know. We have quality control, we have cost control, and everything we do meets the minimum standard. But once you start going beyond that minimum standard, you know, somebody comes in and says, well, that costs, why are you wasting money? Why are you spending extra money? Why are you spending money you don't need to spend? You know, I have this conversation with the heating and air guy every time he comes and checks out our system. He says, well, you know, he says, when that system was made, he says, they used all good stuff and lots of metal, and he says it lasted a long, long time, and the new systems, they last only a certain amount of time because they're built to much stringent standards. When people didn't have ways of measuring, they just made it better than it needed to be. But today, if you look around us, if you look at what the world accepts as normal, it's kind of adequate. It's kind of mediocre. When I used to facilitate training sessions in business, I would ask people to think of the greatest hamburger they ever had in their life, and then think of the worst hamburger they ever had in their life. And I would ask them if either of those came from one of the big chains. And usually it didn't. Occasionally it did, but usually it didn't. Okay? Because there's so much controls built into the processes that the big franchises use that everything comes out about the same. They all come out just about the same. You know. By design, they come out about the same. That's what Ray Kroc was looking for. You could go to one of his restaurants in New York and get the same hamburger you got in California. Consistency, but consistency leads to mediocrity. Mediocrity. And the Shakers didn't believe in that. They didn't believe in that at all. They would look at what they were doing, and they would think, how can this be better? How can this be better? How can we make this the best that it can be? And in the program, they gave one example of they moved to a different part of the country to start a new community, and the normal building materials that they were used to were not available in this new place. So they started to use some of the local material, which was sandstone quarried from the local river bluffs. And the Shaker tradesmen were not familiar with it at all, and they built a house out of it, and they looked at it and said, no, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. So they went and they studied with the local craftsmen until they found out how to make it and make it better. What that did and what that does to us, if we can adopt that same outlook on life, is that in everything they did, in every minute of the day, they saw God. They saw God. Gibran, in his work, The Prophet, he says, in his book, The Prophet, he says, when you work as if you're beloved. If you're building a house, build it as if you're beloved. We're going to live in that house. You know? You imagine the difference of a builder building a spec house to put up for sale, and has to meet certain competitive prices, and has to put into it just exactly what it needs and no more. And then they're building that house for one of their children or spouse, siblings. Which one do you think is going to get the better treatment? And this is what Gibran is saying, but there's a deeper meaning to that. Okay? And the deeper meaning is everyone is your beloved. Everyone is your beloved. Can you see the presence of God in everyone? In everyone. Dr. Bailes tells us, even in the people you disagree with, can you recognize that they're using the same intelligence that you are, only they're using it in a different way. In a different way. Can we learn to see the activity of the divine in everything we touch? Can we learn to see the goodness of God in everything that we do? You know, we are a unique species in that you and I can sit down, take a pencil and paper, or these days a computer, and we can design a building that will be here long after we're gone. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people that we will never meet will benefit from that building. And each one can be blessed by it. Can we think of the love of each and every person who comes in contact with what we leave behind, the things that we leave behind, the things that we do? Recognize them as our beloved. And do what we do proudly for them. Do what we do proudly. And this was the idea behind the community. This was the idea. So I want you to just have this idea of a community of people who were dedicated to the idea of letting that divine flame light their way, inspire them, lead them to do all of the things that they could do and that they should do, but to do it well, because they, each and every one of them, is a living expression of the divine, and the divine love is expressing itself through them and as them. And in so doing, then, every minute of every day is a moment of divine contact. It is a moment of touching the omnipotence. So now I'm going to switch over a little bit to Dr. Bailes. And I just want to give you a couple words, brief biography. I talk about Bailes at least once a year. And I think, as I said, I think it's good that we read different authors and we study the works of different teachers and we listen to different tapes and we do all those things, because sometimes we have to hear this many different ways and from many different people, many different times, and then finally it accumulates on us and we go, oh, I get that. So Dr. Bailes grew up in New Zealand, and he was studying to be a medical missionary. I don't know what denomination he was with, but the idea was that he was going to go out into the bush somewhere and provide religious and medical services to the people who needed it. And for the final 2 years of his training, he had to leave New Zealand and go to London. And there, when he got to London, they found out that he had what was then incurable diabetes. And he couldn't go. He couldn't complete what he intended to do to be the medical missionary because he was ill. And it was that experience that turned him to study what we call New Thought. In England at the time they called Higher Thought. The writings of Thomas Troward, Ralph Waldo Trine's works were popular in Europe. And Bailes, who had studied as a scientist, as a doctor, started to read about metaphysics, and he started to apply the principles, and his diabetes went away. He said it didn't go away right away. It took 2 years, but it went away. But he knew that there was something there. There was something there. See, he had an experience. Ann Lee had a mystical experience, a vision of the presence of Jesus. Frederick Bailes had a different experience. He had a healing. And that led him on this kind of quest to understand more about how this took place and how it is possible that mind, with a capital M, mind can heal us. And hence the book, Your Mind Can Heal You. He came to the United States and he was a religious science minister. He was a co-pastor for many years with Ernest Holmes out in California. And a very popular speaker, author, and teacher. I like Frederick Bailes and his work because he comes at it from a scientific approach. He starts with intellect and logic and reason, and he lays things down, and then he builds up upon that. And that was kind of easier for me as my entry point. That was easier for me. I like the works of Emmett Fox, because Emmett Fox was an electrical engineer and he can describe things in terms of machines that I understand how those machines work. So we find different approaches and we start to read these different approaches and we resonate with them. But in this chat, and one other thing about Bailes. Bailes has written a book called The Basic Principles of Science of Mind. It's a 12-lesson home study course in the basic principles. In treatment, if you want to learn how to do treatment, it's an excellent resource. I checked this morning. You can get a used copy on the internet for $6, and that includes shipping. Or you can get a new copy for about $17, and that includes shipping. If you've never read it, I recommend it as a book that you should have in your library. Get a copy of it, read through it, practice it. But in this chapter then on discovering the powerhouse within you, which I call touching omnipotence, Dr. Bailes kind of takes a slightly different approach. He says, up until now, and this chapter comes towards the end of the book, he says, up until now we have been talking logically and scientifically about this law of mind and how it works and how mind heals and examples of healing and all of these kind of things. He said, but we have to understand, we have to come to understand that the intellect alone is not enough, that logic and reason alone are not enough, that there's this ineffable, mystical contact, this feeling that is beyond or before logic and reason, but it is there. It is there. He says anyone who is an effective healer has it. And he says the great poets have had it. If you read the great poetry of the world, you get a feeling. You get a feeling. The words are there, but there's a feeling there. The poet is able to kind of approach the ineffable and find some words to help us understand what they're trying to talk about, but yet the words in themselves are not enough. And of course that's a hard concept to understand, and it may not make entire sense through logic and reason, and it can't. Because that which we are talking about defies logic and reason. It is beyond logic and reason. And this is kind of the argument between rationalism and materialism and religion, you know. So if what you accept as normal, and Bailes makes this point about what do you expect as normal? What does your idea of what is normal expect to happen? Because what happens in your life is what you expect to be normal. And I thought that was really a great insight, you know. What do you expect as normal? Well, look around you. What you are getting in your life is what you expect as normal. But there's more. See, there's more to it than that. There's more to it than what logic and reason will tell us. There's more to us than what intellect and ego will tell us. It's ineffable. It's this mystical something. It is this touching omnipotence that I'm talking about. It is there, and we can experience it, and we do experience it from time to time. And I think as time goes by, we experience it a little bit more for longer periods of time, more often and for longer periods of time. It is there. We kind of drift in and out of it, in and out of it. Now, one thing that we have to consider as we're talking about this is that it can be a frightening experience for people. Carolyn Myss says that she doesn't know anyone who has who has gone to the mystical experience who hasn't gone insane along the way. Dr. Holmes tells us that we are all insane from time to time, and his definition of insanity is that our emotions lead us. We are just completely controlled by our emotions. We're afraid, we're angry, things like that. It's a form, by his definition, a form of insanity. But I think what we want to do to put this in context is you want to think about what happens when suddenly everything that we have expected as normal, or we have accepted as normal, what happens when we find out that none of that is what we thought it would be? You know, it's kind of Alice in Wonderland. If everything is turned upside down, if up is down, if left is right, if night is day, if day is night, what if everything that we believed in, we believed to be real, we believed ought to be, right? It ought to be that way. That's our opinion. That's our intellect and our ego telling us the way things ought to be. And we suddenly find out that all of that is only an idea. That there's a whole nother way. There's a whole nother way of being, of perceiving. And I think perceiving is a key word, is an operative word. It comes up in spiritual teachings a lot. Perceiving is awareness without judgment. It just is. It just is. What happens to you and I is that when we perceive something, immediately the ego and the intellect go to work analyzing it, labeling it, identifying it, trying to pigeonhole it, you know. And we do this and we take things and we put them in a category, in a pigeonhole somewhere. We think we know all about them and we don't. We just know what pigeonhole we put them in. But we're done with them for now. We're done with that for now. And we think we understand it and we don't. So what happens to us in our path of spiritual growth? What happens to us as we start to grow and we start to have the feeling that Dr. Bailes is talking about, the ineffableness, the feeling? We suddenly come to the realization that everything that we thought we knew may not be correct. Everything that we thought we knew may have another way, another state of being. And this is kind of the struggle then, if you will, between the intellect and the mystical experience. The intellect wants to label it, wants to analyze it, wants to identify it. The soul says, but it happened. But it's there, but it happened. And an excellent resource on that is Richard Maurice Buck's book on cosmic consciousness. It's available in its entirety in PDF format on the internet. Cosmic consciousness. So here's where Bailes is taking us then. There is this thing called omnipotence, this powerhouse. And there's nothing it cannot do. All that can be done, it can do. It is in us. It is through us. It is around us, and it is as us. But we don't accept it as our normal. We don't identify with it. We don't think that that applies to us. Bailes gives the example of now he was in California at the time, so the sun set down. If you're on the coast, it looks like it's going right down into the Pacific Ocean. In fact, sometimes I'm amazed that you don't hear this big sound of water boiling at sunset. You know, that's what it looks like from standing on the shore. And Bailes was working with a businessman who was having anxiety problems. He was very successful, but he worried a lot. And Bailes asked him, he said, is there anything in your life that you see or that you do in which you can recognize power and poise? Poise is knowing what to do and being able to do it. And the businessman said, yes. He said, he says, we have a house on the ocean, and I love to be home at sunset because, he says, there's just something so powerful. Remember, we're talking about this feeling. The poet writes the words, but we read them and we have a feeling. He says, there's this feeling I get when I watch the sunset. I feel the power, I feel the stillness, I feel the poise, I feel the confidence, I just feel it. And Bailes said, well, you have to identify with it. You think it's out there at the sunset. You have to rush home to find it. He says, but what you are experiencing when you look at the sunset is that omnipotence, that power within you. It's the power within you recognizing itself in the sunset. You have to identify with it. You have to make it your own. You have to make it your new normal. And that's what Bailes is telling us. He says, we have grown up in a world that tells us that God is out there somewhere. And that's the normal that we have accepted. We have grown up in a world that says a certain number of people are going to get a certain disease by a certain age, and that's the normal that we have accepted. And if we wish to have a different experience, we have to change to a different normal, a new normal. Robert Fritz, in his book, Creating the Path of Least Resistance, tells us that, a river flowing down a riverbed will always follow the same channel because that's what's cut down in the bedrock. And even if it floods and goes outside its bank, it will eventually go back to its channel, unless it cuts another channel, and you can see the ancient rivers where there's these loops that are just kind of cut off from the main stream. And Fritz says, when we try to behave in a different way, it's like trying to force that river out of the riverbank temporarily. But if we don't change the riverbank, if we don't change the channel, the river channel, it will go back to the way it is. And if we wish to change permanently, we need to create a new path of least resistance. The river channel is the path of least resistance for the water. We need to create a new path of least resistance. Bailes is telling us we have to create a new normal in which we are identified with the omnipotence. We recognize that the power that created the universe is right where we are and ready to do whatever ought to be done in our lives. It is here, it is now. It is not out there. It is not something that we can't use. It is not something that we can't touch. It is here and it is now. And the way he gave in the chapter, the way he gave to do this was so beautiful because it fits in so well with what the Shakers are saying, is he said the simplest way to do this, the simplest way, and you and I can do it. We don't need any special tools. We don't need any special equipment. You don't have to go get a mat or stretch pants or anything. He said, just recognize the beauty and the activity of God in everyone and everything around you. Be aware, be mindful, be here now. How many times we have to hear it? How many different ways? It is here, it is now. Jesus told Thomas, its kingdom is already here and men do not see it. We do not see it. Can we see the activity in the way that a leaf grows on a tree, the way that a blade of grass grows in the ground, the way that nature abhors a vacuum? And if you for any reason, we had a car parked on part of the grass for a while and moved it, there was a big dead spot there. And almost immediately nature went to work and filled it in, and now it's completely covered up. A short time later, nature knows what to do. There's an intelligence that knows what to do. The intelligence that created the universe is right there in that blade of grass. It is in the child at play. It is in the newborn baby. It is in the process by which a sperm and an egg begin to create that little body. When those two cells combine into one, they split and they become one, and then that one splits into two, and two into four, and four into eight, and so on. And this is straight from Frederick Bailes' book. And some become eyes, and some become bones, and who tells them how to do that. What tells them how to do that? Divine love, divine intelligence, divine power, the omnipotence, the omnipotence. And as we do this, we have to not only look out there and say, oh my God, it's in the blade of grass. I know I've told you about, there was a cult in Egypt that worshipped the cow, and we look at that and say, oh, weren't those people silly? They thought the cow was God. And they said, no, they looked at the cow and said, look at this amazing animal. It takes in grass and it gives us milk. Lori and I, in the 70s, we used to subscribe to organic gardening and Mother Earth News and all of the kind of hippie things when we were moving to the country. And I remember one of the authors one time started an article out, and he says, it said, scientists have discovered a way that you can feed your children milk. You can convert ordinary lawn clippings into milk. And then the punchline was, all you need is a pail and a cow. Right? How does the cow know to do that? It just does it. It just does it. So what Bailes is telling us is not only look out there and say, oh my goodness, I can see the love and the activity and the presence of God, the omnipotence in the universe, I love to look at the pictures from the Hubble and go, wow, what holds all that in place? But we have to identify with it. We have to recognize that same intelligence, that same power, by whatever name we choose to call it, that is where we are. That is what we are. And it is working on our behalf right now. So we don't need to struggle or fight against any form of sickness or lack or limitation in our lives or any of those things. That's not what we need to do. That's not how the healing takes place. The healing takes place by recognizing the perfection of God's activity and the omnipotence of divine action. Right where the sickness or the restrictions or the problem seems to be. How would God see the problem? How would divine omnipotence see what we call to be a problem? I often thought about that when my job was solving very complex problems in business. We would look at a problem and we'd say, my God, this thing is huge. And then I would laugh and I'd say, my God, how would God see? God wouldn't see a problem at all. Emmett Fox tells us to turn completely away from the problem and turn completely to God. So I hope that we take some time to look for some resources. If you don't want to buy the book, the Bailes book, you can probably get it through your library or if they don't have it, through interlibrary loan. You can get it, you can read it. Take time to meditate. Take time for your spiritual practice. It's not good enough just to read about it or listen to it. We have to take time to make ourselves available to touch the omnipotence. The Shakers would work all day, and in their daily activity, they would consciously recognize that what they were doing was the activity of God expressing through them, but then at night they would sit and take time to meditate. Take time to meditate. Your spiritual growth is the most important thing that there is. There's nothing more important. Nothing more important. Take time to read. Take time to study. Take time to be. And then, as both the Shakers and Dr. Bailes tells us, every minute of every day, try to see, to experience, to not just see it, but to feel it as an experience, to perceive it, the presence and the activity of God in each and everything we do. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to touch the omnipotence. It may be scary at first. You may start to recognize that you're seeing things differently, you're experiencing things differently. But don't be afraid. It is your destiny. It is why you are here. To see, to feel, and to experience the presence of God every moment of every day, now and forever. And so it is.